What's that? We'll pull it back after they speak.
Good evening. I'm Michael Ignatieff. I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy and the Carr Professor of Human Rights Practice. Welcome to tonight's forum on what has to be the central issue in international politics, which is, should American power be tamed? Can it be tamed? If so, how? This is the central issue of world politics, simply because we live in a world where the chief driver of international politics is a superpower that is decisively unconstrained by the traditional ways in which power has been constrained through the 20th century, that is, equivalent counterpower, multilateral institutions. We're in a world in which the regulation and management and control and balancing of American power has become the chief dilemma of, for pretty well every country in the world. Let me introduce our panel very quickly. Steve Walt, Robert Rene Belfer Professor of International Affairs, Academic Dean of this school, author of Taming American Power. This is now a commercial interlude. You should see this book and buy it as quickly as you can. Zania Dormandy, who's the Executive Director for Research at the Belfer Center. And until recently, she serves as Director for South Asia at the National Security Council. She is also, ye desperate students wondering what life actually is possible after you get out of this place, she's a graduate of the Kennedy School. Look at her. There we are. And finally, on my far left, a very distinguished British diplomat with long service at the United Nations, Sir Kiran Prendergast. Sir Kiran is the Goodman United Nations Fellow at the Belfer Center, and he was, as many people will know, Under Secretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations. Essentially Kofi Annan's chief political advisor, so a man with extensive experience at the top of the international system. Our format will be as follows. Steve Walt will get up and essentially outline some of the key themes in his book, and then I'll ask Zania and Kiran to respond. We'll have a brief exchange. We'll then open out to questions about 6:45, and we're out of here between 7:10 and 7:15. So, Steve.
Thank you very much, Michael. This is by far the most intimidating audience I will face all year talking about this topic. When I speak about this subject elsewhere, it's great. They think I'm from Harvard and they show me lots of deference, and if things go badly, I just blow town. The difficulty here is lots of people know me. They show me no deference at all, which is precisely what I deserve. And of course, if things go badly, I get to hang around here and people can sneer. So I feel an unusual degree of pressure. For the last 15 years or so, the United States has been in this unprecedented position. And the cliche has become that we're the mightiest country since Rome. We've got about a quarter of the world economy. Our defense spending is equal to the next 20 countries combined or so. We have a leading role in most international institutions. Our media and cultural industries cast a very large shadow. And all of this has led Americans to spend a lot of time debating what to do with this extraordinary position. For the rest of the world, the question's been different. It is, what do you do about American power? How do you deal with the 800-pound gorilla that is us? If you're the president of France or Russia, prime minister of India, prime minister of Israel, Pakistan, Mexico, what do you do about American power? What are your options, and how can you try to constrain what the United States might do? So what I want to do is address three questions. First of all, why does American primacy, America's dominant position, make others uncomfortable? Second, what can they do about it? What are the strategies they can use to tame it, tame American power? And then finally, given what they are already doing, what should the United States do in response? And I want to start by recognizing or trying to convince you that there is, in fact, quite a large gap between American views of its own primacy and how our primacy looks to others. So first of all, Americans tend to see our role in the world in very positive terms, and I've given you some representative statements up there. Sam Huntington, our colleague here at Harvard, American primacy central to the future of freedom, democracy, and international order. President Clinton, the United States is indispensable to stable political relations. We are a beacon of hope around the world. George Bush, when asked why 9/11 happened, he said he just couldn't believe there was such vitriolic hatred because he knows how good we are. Prominent neoconservatives, Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, American hegemony is the only reliable defense against the breakdown of peace and international order. And finally, Prime Minister Tony Blair, whom I'm calling an honorary American, with apologies to Sir Kiran. America is a force for good in the world. Anti-Americanism is a foolish indulgence. Some foreign observers don't agree with that. The first one, John le Carre, this was a headline in the Times of London just before the war in Iraq. The United States of America has gone bad, or gone mad, rather. Günter Grass, the Nobel Prize-winning author, comparing Osama bin Laden to President Bush. Both are always talking about God. The Prime Minister of Spain, who was elected following the Madrid bombings, the occupation of Iraq has been a disaster. You can't organize a war with lies. And finally, Osama bin Laden, one of his many accusations of the United States. So suggesting there is at least some foreign disagreement with our role. If you start looking at global public opinion, ask Americans the question, do we consider the interests of others in conducting foreign policy? We tend to think so. If you ask the same question around the world, you get a very different answer, where they don't think we take others' interests into account, not even in England, which is the place where we do the best in this particular question. If you then ask the question, how do you view the influence of the United States? This is from a January 2005 BBC poll. 21 countries, only 5 in which a majority of the people polled had a positive view of American influence around the world. Quite a disturbing set of numbers there, at least from an American perspective. If you want to see the trend lines from the year 2000 forward, again, a lot of missing data in here because they didn't ask the questions in the same places every year, but the trend line pretty steadily downward. The low point is really March 2003 when we go into Iraq. It rebounds briefly when things go well and then begins to slide back down again. If you ask Americans, why are we conducting a war on terrorism, we think the answer is obvious, because they attacked us. We tend to reject various ulterior motives, that we're trying to control the oil or dominate the Middle East, etc. But again, if you go overseas, they are much more willing to explain the war on terrorism by pointing to various ulterior motives that might be explaining what we're up to. If you ask to rate The United States vis-a-vis China, this is from this past summer. Quite surprisingly, a number of countries we would normally regard as American allies now have a more favorable view of China than of the United States. Some Americans may find that disturbing. And finally, if you ask the question, would it be better if another country came up and rivaled American military power, you get a surprising gap there between how we tend to view that subject. Americans, quite surprisingly, don't think that's such a hot idea, but the rest of the world thinks that's an increasingly good idea, and by quite surprising numbers, Michael will be pleased to see that Canada, it's 51-49. So when you go back there, you may be able to tilt it back the other way relatively easily. All right, the question is, what's going on here? If we are, in fact, a benevolent force in the world, then why are we viewed so differently abroad? And I think there are three main reasons. One reason is simply that we are the 800-pound gorilla. We are as big as we are. And again, it might seem strange to us because Americans have this benevolent view of our global role, but all we have to do is ask ourselves how we would feel if some other country stood in relation to us as we now stand to the rest of the world. Would that make us uncomfortable? I think it probably would. The United States has wanted to be number one for a long time because we think that makes us safer and we think it gives us more influence. Well, by the same logic, when we are that far ahead of others, they tend to look at us as someone who might misbehave, makes them nervous, it decreases their influence. They can't be sure what we might do in the future. They know conflicts of interest will arise, and being weaker than us will make them vulnerable to our pressure. And finally, and this is something Americans tend to miss, other states have to worry that we may take actions for perfectly reasonable reasons that nonetheless affect their interests and harm their interests inadvertently. If we take actions that, say, drive up world oil prices, that affects every oil importing country, whether we intended to hurt them or not. If we did something on the North Korean peninsula that caused a war to break out, South Korea would be damaged not because we intended to harm South Korea, but because it was an inadvertent consequence of something we'd done. In other words, other states have to worry about us because our power is so great, our actions will have far-reaching consequences regardless of what our intentions are. And the late Prime Minister of, again, Canada put this quite well, Pierre Trudeau, who said that being near the United States is like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how well-behaved or well-intentioned the beast, you are still affected by every twitch and grunt. And given America's role in the world today, and given how large our power is, our twitches and grunts are now felt in every corner. So that's one problem. Second problem is, of course, what we actually do with our power. It's the specific policies that we adopt that tend to conflict with the interests of others. There is, in fact, lots of admiration for American values, for American democracy, for the strength of the American economy around the world. It is not, in fact, what we are in the sense of American values that bothers us. It's rather what we do. And let me give you some examples drawn from probably the area where we've had the most trouble. This is a survey from 2004 of Arab attitudes towards a variety of features about the United States, our values, our economy, our science and technical achievements. And the key to note is, although the numbers near the top there are not uniformly positive, they are surprisingly positive, given what you might think. It's when you get down towards the bottom and you're seeing, policy towards the Arab world, policy towards the Palestinians, policy towards Iraq, policy towards terrorism. The key word there is policy. Most of the negative reactions are generated by things that the United States does. Same survey, if you ask the open-ended question, what's the first thought that comes into your mind when you hear the word America? I've bold-faced the one that leaps out there. You get lots of different responses, but the one that seems to be most frequent of all of those is unfair foreign policy. Again, not a reaction to American values, not American democracy, rather American actions. And then finally, this problem has been studied by a number of other different groups, and I've just excerpted some conclusions there. The State Department's study group on public diplomacy in the Arab world, a Defense Science Board study from fall 2004 on the same subject, and the Pew Global Attitude Survey, all of them drawing essentially the same conclusion, that anti-Americanism is not primarily a reaction to American values, but rather a reaction to American policies. All right, third point, third reason is hypocrisy. All right, the United States is not the only hypocritical country in the world, but like all countries, we tend to adopt one standard for our own conduct and another standard for others, and this makes the problem even worse because it's seen as quite inconsistent abroad. Just one example of that, we don't think other countries should have nuclear weapons or acquire nuclear weapons, but we're perfectly willing to keep lots of them ourselves. This led the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed al-Baradei, to say that the United States is like someone with a cigarette dangling from their mouths, loudly telling everyone else not to smoke. That problem, again, is not unique to the United States, but I think it is an unusual problem for us, again, given our dominant world role. Now, the final question is, why don't we get this as a country? President Bush told reporters after 9/11 he was amazed to learn that there was hatred of America. Secretary of State Rice was asked why France and Germany opposed the war on Iraq, and she said, I'll just put it very bluntly, we simply didn't understand it. And I think this captures a problem that's fairly widespread. First, we don't understand anti-Americanism because we affect others a lot more than they affect us. Our power is so large, we don't notice, we don't feel the damage that we are doing to others. Second, when you're trying to run the entire world, your attention is inevitably divided. So you don't notice something that's happening in Latin America because you're spending all your time worrying about the Middle East, or you suddenly are worrying about problems in Africa and you forget how you may be affecting people in some other part of the world. They, on the other hand, are paying a lot of attention to what the United States is doing all of the time. Thirdly, to the extent that we conduct policy in secret, to the extent that our government is doing things that it is not telling us about, we may be harming others, they may be taking on anti-American attitudes, and we don't know why because we, again, don't know the full extent of our own activities. And finally, like all countries, we tend to sugarcoat our own history. We tend to remember well the positive things we've done and like to talk a lot about them, and we tend not to write up the more sordid parts of our past. But again, those parts other countries remember. They remember bad things we've done to them, even if we have done our best to try and forget them. Now, again, I think those are true or common to lots of countries. They're not unique to the United States, but given our size and our prominence, it's a real problem for us. So the bottom line here is not good. Our power makes us dangerous or appear dangerous to others. They don't like some of the policies we've followed, and they don't like the double standards we sometimes adopt. The immediate counter you will sometimes get is, yes, but that doesn't really matter because the United States is so large and capable, there's not much anybody can do about it. And let me suggest some of the things that states can do to try and deal with us. First, on the sort of positive side, there's a variety of things they can do if they want to basically go along with the United States. You can bandwagon with us. We occasionally, very rarely, can in fact pressure or intimidate countries into joining us or selling out. And the one good example I talk about in the book is Libya's decision to give up its weapons of mass destruction, which I think you can see as an example of a country that after 10 plus years of multilateral economic sanctions essentially decided to throw in the towel. Right? But that's the only clear-cut case I can find, and even that one has some ambiguity in it. Second, they can ally with us to deal with local threats, regional balancing. That's good. We like having allies. The only trick for Americans is to make sure, of course, that those are alliances that advance American interests rather than just the interests of the states that are allying with us. Third, they can follow Tony Blair's strategy and the strategy of most of his predecessors, form close personal ties with American leaders, establish a special relationship with the United States, and in particular with an American president. There are not very many countries, I think, that can do that. And finally, they can try to manipulate the American political system. We are a very open democracy, lots of channels of influence, and a number of countries, Israel, Taiwan, India, Armenia, Greece, have been able to exploit the American political system to make sure that American foreign policy in particular ways supports their interests as well. So there are already a variety of strategies available for taming American power. More interestingly, what if you want to oppose the United States? You can balance, as France, Russia, and Germany did within the Security Council. By adopting a unified strategy, they made it easier for other states to oppose the United States in the Security Council. The Iraqi insurgency, possibly with help from Syria and Iran, is balancing against us in Iraq and doing a pretty good job of it, I might add. Other countries attempt to acquire weapons of mass destruction in order to, again, negate certain aspects of American power. So there are, in fact, opportunities to balance even a country as strong as the United States. They can balk, just refuse to do what we ask them to do. The Turks balked when we asked to use their territory to invade Iraq, and Latin America has balked when we've asked them to put pressure on the Chavez regime in Venezuela. They can blackmail us, which is what North Korea is doing, threatening to develop its nuclear weapons capabilities unless we are willing to buy them off with additional forms of aid. And finally, and perhaps the one I find most interesting, is other states can try to delegitimate America's position and America's policies by trying to portray the United States as misguided, selfish, or venal. And let me give you a couple of examples of this. This is Osama bin Laden on the United States. And just as you read down through here, the key to note is all of the different accusations he is leveling at the United States. We're a polluter, we drink too much, we take too many drugs, we treat women badly, and if you notice down at the very bottom, he's even in favor of campaign finance reform, suggesting that money plays too big a role in American elections. And this should be seen as a political document. He's attempting to persuade others that the United States is not morally worthy of being followed or being listened to. Second example, this is excerpts from a Chinese report published earlier this year on America's human rights record. Now, we put out a report every year on human rights around the world, and we always criticize the Chinese for their human rights violations. This was their response, which was to go through and find as many unpleasant aspects of American society and put them out in a public document. And again, the key is not whether or not they're right. The key is in the battle for hearts and minds around the world, this may be, in fact, quite effective, and it is a form of delegitimation. So what should the United States do about this? Well, let me suggest briefly, if you look at the third bullet point there, the first thing the United States needs is better spelling on its PowerPoint. 5 things. First, we ought to basically return at the most general level to a policy of what I call, along with some others, offshore balancing, and stop using military force to impose our political preferences on others. By offshore balancing, I mean removing American military forces from most parts of the world, and certainly large military deployments, recognizing that we don't need to control large areas of the world. We just need to be able to deny hostile powers control of those key areas. I think this is a strategy that recognizes the power of nationalism versus the power of imperial control. It respects, in sort, the history of the 20th century. It also recognizes that foreign military occupations are now the biggest driver of terrorism in the world, and that, in fact, if our global footprint were smaller, our terrorism problem would be substantially less. Second, we can tame our power most easily by essentially taming it ourselves, a policy of self-restraint. We want to use our power judiciously, effectively, and wisely so that others are not constantly looking for ways to try and keep it under control. Perhaps the most obvious example I can point to would be repudiating the 2002 National Security Strategy and its emphasis on military preemption. My preference would be a policy that is sort of an ask questions first, shoot later policy. Other states already recognize what the American military can do. We don't need to emphasize preemption because people know that that is an option that's available to us anytime we might need it. But putting it up in bright lights merely increases everyone's concerns about how we might use our power going forward. It also increases other states' incentives to have weapons of mass destruction because they might be looking for a way to deter us from using it. The comparison of how we dealt with Iraq that didn't have weapons of mass destruction and how we have dealt with North Korea, which we believe does, is a good object lesson for others. Third, as a number of the studies I referred to earlier suggest, we need to do a much better job of public diplomacy, and that means, I think, thinking about the problem a little bit differently. First of all, we have to have a foreign policy that's easier to sell. You need a good product. It is not just a matter of spin. But secondly, we have tended to think of public diplomacy the same way we think about running for office or the same way we think about selling consumer products. Right? Karen Hughes, I think, is genuine and sincere in her efforts as our new public diplomacy czar, but her experience is running elections in the United States. An election is a one-time event. You're just trying to make your candidate look a little better than the opponent. Public diplomacy is about creating something much more lasting. It's about changing attitudes over time, and that means you have to give people something tangible. That is not just rhetoric, not just image, but rather the belief that what the United States is doing is actually acting for the greater good of human beings. It has to be much more tangible and much more sustained. And that will require, in my view, a broader effort to improve our ability to communicate with others. I can say more about that perhaps in response to questions. Fourth, the United States needs to deal with the basic trade-off between our close relationship with Israel and the continued conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. This is a major source of anti-Americanism in the Arab and Islamic world and elsewhere in the world, where basically there aren't any other countries who think our policy there has been correct. This, in my view, is not about abandoning Israel. It's rather about viewing the Israel-Palestinian problem as a national security issue for the United States, and therefore something that deserves very high priority to finally bring that one to a final and just settlement. Last but not least, I call in the book for what I call a grand bargain on nuclear weapons technology. As you undoubtedly already know by being at the Kennedy School, which is sort of nuclear terrorism central, this is a really serious issue for the United States. You could argue it's probably the one we ought to be worrying about most if you think there's any likelihood at all. And in order to reduce that probability as low as possible, we need a much more robust global nuclear control regime. That requires other countries to do an awful lot of things. The problem is we are expecting them to do all of those things without offering much in response, without making any concessions of our own. So in a sense, I would be willing to trade a large portion of the US nuclear arsenal for a greatly enhanced global nonproliferation and nuclear control regime. That's the bargain. We begin to live up to our commitments in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we expect others to then make various adjustments designed to both limit the possibility of proliferation and also improve nuclear custody. All right, let me just wrap this up. At a very fundamental level, I think the core is the kind of world we want to live in. The United States is going to be the #1 power for a long time, but the question is it going to be #1 in a world where most other countries and most people agree with America's basic goals and values and see American primacy as a more or less desirable thing? You could imagine that being a rather permissive world. Or will we be #1 in a world where other states fear the United States, resent its power, and are looking for opportunities, sort of getting up every morning looking for some way to bother the United States, even if only in a small way? You could think of that as a highly resistant environment, a world that's filled with friction. I think it's obvious the United States would prefer the former world. My concern is that we have been acting in ways that are more likely to create the second. If you think back to the 2000 presidential campaign, candidate George Bush said that other nations would be attracted to the United States if it were strong but humble. They would be repulsed, he said, if the United States acted in an arrogant fashion. And I think he was dead right. I think his policies and those of his associates ignored that very wise advice. There will always be some tendency to envy and resist the dominant power. But the dominant powers also have lots of ways to try and limit that reaction. If the United States acts properly, most other states will understand the value of American leadership, be less inclined to challenge it. In other words, we have a lot of control over the extent to which others are trying to tame US power. And in fact, that's a pretty good way of judging the success of American foreign policy. Just how hard is the rest of the world trying to keep us under control? Thank you. I look forward to the comments from the rest of the panel. Thanks very much.
I thought we'd hear from Zania Dormandy first, and we can just fire away.
Okay, thank you very much, and most interesting. I think Steve's book answers a really important question, and does a very, very good job of answering that question. Does a very, very good job of taking a look and providing an analytical framework through which we, the policymaker, we, the students, we, the academics, can approach the way the US acts overseas foreign policy. I want to focus on the last chapter of his book. And the last chapter of his book really talks about not the analytical framework so much, but how you use that analytical framework, how the Bush administration has used it, how previous administrations have used it, and how we might use it moving forward. And Steve laid out a number of hypotheses or recommendations for the US government. I agree with a number of things. I agree that, and he writes this up front, our goal is to retain US power and avoid giving other states additional incentives to build up their own power. Absolutely, I don't think anybody can dispute that. I also agree with something you said, and you reiterated today, which is that the US should use its military force with forbearance. I would dispute, however, the fact that preventive war is the centerpiece of US foreign policy. I would argue that preventive war is the piece of US foreign policy that has been talked about most and that is most controversial. But it is not a good descriptor of the way US foreign policy is currently run. I'd also agree with your statement that we should work to reassure our allies that it will use the force that we have at our disposal with wisdom and restraint, and that's what you say in the book. And I agree, you've spoken about our appalling public diplomacy. You're absolutely right. Really, we've done a terribly bad job at that. And there are a lot of people in Washington who are trying to do a better job. And I will advise them wholeheartedly to read your book. And it may give them some guidance in that. You also, and you didn't say this evening, but your book suggests that you don't go so far as to say that we should hand over our foreign policy to others to have a say in, but you suggest that maybe we might want to take the input from organizations like NATO or the UN or maybe even some regional powers, the UK. And I would argue that unless we go the whole way in giving, say, the UN veto power of some sort over our policy, it will not do the job that you're suggesting it will do. Because unless there's no ambiguity, no one will believe that we will use that restraint. You put forward 3 options in the book for US action: global hegemony, which I think you suggest is what we currently follow. Selective engagement, which you describe as being the kind of Clinton-Bush 41 approach, where we have large deployed military forces overseas, but in bilateral or multilateral alliances. Or the final version, which offshore balancing, which you would suggest is the right way forward. I would argue that it's different for each circumstances, and I would argue both in terms of what the current administration, what type of policy the current administration uses. I would say they use a little bit of all 3, and they need to continue using a little bit of all 3, with all of the problems and faults that go along with that. Global hegemony. I would say that our willingness to be out in front and to put things on the table and make decisions played a huge role in the actions of Libya in giving up its nuclear weapons. I would also say that it played a significant role in what you saw this past year take place in Lebanon and the Ukraine and a number of other countries in terms of democracy and the spread of democracy. I don't think those would have happened without the US leadership. So I think that there are some impacts that would not happen without us or another country coming out and saying, this is what we believe in, this is what we're going to do, and we want you all to follow us. Selective engagement. Again, I think the US government, the current administration, has done that on a number of occasions. I'll give you some examples. With Iran, the EU3, I think that's an example of selective engagement. We worked with the 3 EU countries that have been leading this initiative, and we took the second position in that. North Korea, 6-party talks. If that isn't selective engagement, I'm not quite sure what is. And again, I think that was extraordinarily successful. I don't think another approach would have worked. Proliferation Security Initiative, it's something you mentioned in the book. Again, that's something that is not the US, but is a collaboration amongst, I think, something like 13 now or 14 countries that are in the core, and a vast number more that are involved in this thing called the Proliferation Security Initiative. You're absolutely right about offshore balancing. It is something that we should use, we should arguably use more of. I would say, again, the US government has done that. I think that's been our approach to the events earlier this year in Nepal when King Gyanendra dismissed the government. There's a case where we haven't sent in troops, we haven't got heavily involved, but we've worked with a number of regional and extra-regional powers to try and influence change or to persuade. The US government is a strong supporter of NATO, it's a strong supporter of APEC, a number of other groups. Again, I think you will have seen a number of our policies or US policies that have done that. And I think all of those are very important. My concern with taking the approach of just doing, implementing offshore balancing is I'm not sure that other countries or entities will fill the gap. And so then you have a question. You talk about offshore balancing and only taking the further step. If it's of vital US interest, how do we define what is in vital US interest? And I would say that in the last 5, 10, 15 years, what is in vital US interest has grown. So you can now argue that environmental issues are in vital US interest. Health issues, they're of vital US interest. So how do you draw the line, and who gets to draw the line about what it is that we should take action in and what occasions we shouldn't take action? So I don't want to take any more time, and I want to pass over to my colleague here on my left, but I would say I think the analysis is fantastic. I will recommend it highly to my colleagues up in Washington as a good way to think through the process. I disagree with your conclusion that says the way forward is offshore balancing. I think we need to continue using a little bit of everything.
Sir Kiran.
I think it's a very well-written book. I think it's important to say that in an academic environment, because many academic books are not well-written. This is written in plain English. It's very readable.
Bless you.
And you may quote me for a very small commission as your book rockets up the Amazon.com sales list. I think it does a really important service to policymakers in the United States, because it does something which is rarely done, which is to take a really hard look at how the United States is seen elsewhere in the world. People often say to see ourselves as others see us, but they rarely do it. Are you Athens or are you Sparta? It's clear from the book that most Americans think that the United States is Athens, that it is fundamentally good and its policy is fundamentally benevolent. But then the book sets out fairly clearly why others don't take that view. When I was at the UN, I was keenly aware of the nervousness in Latin America about being associated with the gringos, especially bilaterally. And by the way, that's one good argument for multilateral engagement, is that people are willing to do things when there is a multilateral legitimation that they're not willing to do bilaterally. And then I read in the book that the United States has been responsible for the overthrow of at least 9 democratically elected governments, and there's a whole raft of other misdeeds over the decades. It's clear also from the book, and explained very clearly, that US culture attracts but also repels. I think that's important to understand. People enjoy, they like the freedom, they like the enterprise, they like the opportunities, they like the Coke, they may even like the Pepsi, they like the jeans, but they dislike the gross inequalities, they dislike what they regard as double standards, they dislike bullying, they dislike pornography and loose women, they probably dislike the recognition of rights for gays. So these things operate on both sides of the equation. I think that Steve explains very clearly the great damage that American foreign policy in the Middle East has done for the image of the United States in the Muslim world, and particularly in the Arab world. And I think that his analysis of the operation of various lobbies is quite riveting. His policy recommendations are quite startling and stark. Maybe one has to recognize that foreign policy in any country has to take full account of domestic considerations. But I would say at a minimum, he sets out a really compelling case for the United States in its Middle East policy to be seen to be acting with at least a minimum of impartiality. I think one has to recognize that there are many countries that love the United States and really want a much closer relationship. And very often these are countries like those in Eastern Europe that have had to groan under a different form of oppression or repression over the decades, and for whom the United States is seen very strongly as a savior. And it's not, it's not fair not to acknowledge that. I think one has to understand that there are other countries that see a very strong interest in building a better relationship, a closer relationship, sometimes in particular areas such as defense, and sometimes across the board. Again, he brings out very clearly the way in which the relationship with India has evolved in a very strongly positive way that probably wouldn't have been conceivable about a decade ago. So, I mean, I think he performs a valuable service in analyzing rather mercilessly the way in which the United States is seen. I think he's very, very good at setting out the reasons why other states may behave in a way which may seem to most Americans to be rather irrational and unreasonable. On North Korea, for example, Zania made a reference to preventive war, but this afternoon I reread the National Security Strategy of 2002. There's a specific mention of North Korea. There are repeated references to preventive wars, rogue states acting before weapons of mass destruction are fully developed. And this explains why when we've been dealing with the North Koreans, they tell us that they have been publicly threatened with a preemptive attack by the United States. So, you know, they may be crazy, but they're not mad. You know, countries do read what the government says, they listen to axis of evil, they draw conclusions from it. They may be different conclusions from what Americans draw, but these are nevertheless, from their perspective, rational conclusions, and they need to be factored into American policymaking. I'm not quite sure what to say about offshore balancing and all the rest of it, because my own view is that, or my own experience is that governments tend to make policy in a less abstract way than that. They also tend very often to have inconsistent policies. They may have offshore balancing over here, and they may have hegemony over there, or they may, you know, they may oscillate from one to the other. I think I would say that the world cannot manage the crises that it has without American leadership. Yes, there is an element of jealousy and resentment that is natural. I think that attitudes taken, particularly what you might call punitive public remarks, can make things worse. But I believe that most of the studies that have been done, commissioned by the US government, show that 80% of it, at least 80% of it, is the policy stupid. You need United States leadership because otherwise you have vehicles which have no engine. I think there is a very widespread, even if grudging, acceptance of the need for US leadership, but people want it, as the book sets out very clearly, they want it to be exercised in a persuasive way, not a coercive way, and they want it to be exercised in a way which is consistent. They're keenly aware of double standards. So I think that this should not only rocket up the list of Amazon, but it should be required reading by all senior public officials working in the peace and security field. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I ask Steve to make a hopefully brief reaction so that we have time to open up for questions, I wanted to exploit my chairman's prerogative and throw another thing at you, which is get your comment on the following issue. How America treats its friends, not its enemies, how it treats its friends. I see one very simple thing happening. The price of saying no to the United States is actually going down. When you look at the Iraq story, Europe basically said no to the war. Canada said no to the war and paid, in certain ways, a rather small price for saying no. So one aspect about American power is the curious way in which its capacity to influence and coerce its friends seems to me, in historical terms, to be declining, with potentially serious implications for American capacity to manage alliances in the future. On the other side, the advantages to America's friends of saying yes are also going down. That is, Tony Blair says, I'll give you legitimacy and cover for this high-wire act in Iraq, but you've got to give me something on Israel-Palestine, or you've got to give me something on world debt, or you've got to give me... That is, it's easier to say no to the United States, and it's the price of saying yes to the United States, the benefits of saying yes to the United States are also in. Do you have any suggestions of how the United States can better manage its relationships with its friends? Because I see 25, 30 years into the future, America having no friends among advanced liberal democratic states.
Okay. First of all, everyone here has been way too kind, and I'm going to have to count on the audience to really explain what's wrong with all of my ideas, because you were all much too gentle. I'll try to be very, very brief. Preventive war is obviously not the policy that we follow 24/7, because you can't be fighting preventive wars every week. The problem is that once we made that an official doctrinal statement and went to great lengths to emphasize that this was now the national security policy of the United States, the threat hovers out there. Now, we then proceeded to demonstrate that we really meant business by the one case in Iraq. And of course, if Iraq had gone differently, of course, that would be seen as, we've proven this works, and we would be feeling really good about it. I'd like to use this as an opportunity to say, so we've learned from that experience, and that threat is not gone, because no great power would ever not preempt an imminent threat, but you don't have to necessarily advertise it all the time. Second, where are we now? I mean, Zania characterized sort of the Bush administration in somewhat more reasonable terms than I had. I think that, in fact, what we have seen is some learning, right? The hubris of the first term has been tempered by some of the problems that have resulted. On the question, though, of whether the United States should be out in front, I think, again, when the United States is in this extraordinary position, we actually gain an enormous amount by, in a sense, being able to be more in the background and share the credit, rather than by insisting on doing all of the heavy lifting ourselves, setting the complete agenda. My read of the Libya case, for example, is we actually allowed the British to do a lot of the work with Libya. We were back there, we were supporting it, we were at times applying screws in various ways, but much of the actual face-to-face stuff was done with the British, and it was more effective for that reason. You might make the same argument with respect to the EU3 as you said. With respect to offshore balancing, Nepal is not our issue right now. It's relatively easy to sort of think that maybe we're not going into Nepal. But let me use a harder case, which is the Persian Gulf. We had an offshore balancing policy from 1945 to 1991. We did not put large U.S. combat forces in the Persian Gulf region. We had very small little advisory contingents. We had basing rights of various kinds. We were prepared to go in there, but we kept our own forces out, and we used a balance of power policy. We leaned on Iran, then we leaned on Iraq, we relied on Saudi Arabia, we relied primarily on local actors, and we were prepared to go in if the balance of power ever broke down, as we did in 1990-91, very effectively to throw Iraq out. After 91, of course, we abandoned that policy and had a large-scale deployment in the region. And of course, that deployment got a lot bigger when we invaded Iraq in 2003 and has been generating much of the extremist resistance. So if a balance of power policy would work in the Persian Gulf back in the Cold War, when we were, among other things, trying to keep the Soviet Union out of the Persian Gulf region, the question is, in a world which no longer has another superpower rival out there, why doesn't a balance of power policy where the United States relies on naval and air power and diplomatic relations with those countries, but primarily leans on the local actors to uphold the local balance and only intervenes if that local balance breaks down? That's what I mean by offshore balancing. And by the way, I believe Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was moving in that direction in the first year in office, prior to 9/11. That's what he saw as the way to organize and deploy American military forces. No longer have large peacetime deployments in Europe, only go places where we need to go and then come home as quickly as possible until he, again, sort of got seduced into Iraq. Finally, on Michael's very interesting question. I mean, first of all, it's in some sense always harder to pressure your friends than your enemies because there's a relationship there that you don't want to sever. It's easy to try and put the screws to your opponents because you don't care really about losing something. In terms of how we could manage friendships better, I actually, and I say this in the conclusion of the book, I actually think an offshore balancing policy facilitates that because in a sense the United States starts to play hard to get. We suddenly begin to make our support for others more conditional on their willingness to support our particular objectives. So if India wants to have a good, close allied or security relationship with the United States, we're going to expect some consideration from India. If France, Germany, Britain want to have a close relationship with the United States and be able to count on us in certain circumstances, then they're going to have to show us some consideration on issues we care about. We're sort of back to real diplomacy. I'll just mention one other thing. Of course, people don't always recognize this is what the end of the Cold War really meant. It meant that the automatic glue that had held us together with lots of our traditional allies is no longer there. And what hasn't happened yet is a real shift in both American diplomatic attitudes, but also America's sense of how it deals with both friends and enemies in a world where we are the 800-pound gorilla and there isn't another one out there, at least not at the moment.
Okay. We've got about 15, 20 minutes. We've got a microphone here. We've got a microphone there. We have a microphone up there. And we have a microphone there. One question per customer, not two. Don't piggyback 12 in one, right? No statements. Questions are very short interrogative forms that end in an actual question mark and are directed to a specific person. And we got 3 here. So we'll start here, we'll go there, we'll go up there and up there. Right here.
My name's Juliet Simel from Harvard College, and I'd like to address a question to Professor Walt on the effects that you think Hurricane Katrina will have had on America's image and perhaps its power in the world.
That's not a setup question, but I actually have an article coming out in the Financial Times on that question, so I better be able to have an answer for this one. I think there are three things to say. I mean, American power or American influence in the world really does rest on 3 things. Our material capabilities, economic, military, and others, the belief that others think we're doing the right thing in the world, and finally, their confidence that we know what we're doing, that we're competent. And Katrina, when you think about it, affects all three. And if you read the foreign press, which I spent an afternoon doing on Katrina, you see all three themes coming out. First of all, they immediately recognize that resources now are going to have to be devoted to reconstruction, and that means resources that aren't available to subsidize peace agreements in various parts of the world, to influence events elsewhere. They understand that. Second, in a number of foreign commentaries, it highlights the social inequalities within the United States, which is a theme of foreign views of the United States. Great economy, not much of a safety net, not much consideration for people who are disadvantaged. So one more reason that you don't have to follow the American lead. And then finally, the way we handled it makes us look incompetent, makes us look like bums, and that gets commented as well. Foreign op-ed writers, foreign reporters saying, how can the United States promise to save the world when it can't even rescue people in New Orleans? So Katrina is bad news for American influence, which means how we deal with the reconstruction after Katrina is an opportunity. Right? If we do that as well as we put a person on the moon, or as well as we did the Marshall Plan, or as well as we did the Manhattan Project, that restores confidence in US leadership. If we do it as well as, say, we're handling the reconstruction of the World Trade Center, it's going to compound this problem.
Question there.
Hello, my name is Kai Monheim. I'm from Germany. I'm in an MPP1. Reading the title Taming American Power, I was wondering if we look at the United Nations, what you would advise the American government how to tame American power within a restructured Security Council. How should that be restructured?
That's a great question, and I don't have a lot of expertise. Kiran may want to comment more upon that one. I don't view the United Nations as the be-all and end-all in world politics. I regard it as a very useful tool of diplomatic action. It's an instrument that countries use to try and advance their interests. We have been using it, the whole question of Security Council reform, as a way, in some respects, to punish countries who we're mad at. Germany foremost among them. I mean, I think the United States did act to deny Germany permanent membership in the Security Council as a rebuke for previous policies. I think that was actually pretty short-sighted, that ultimately we probably need to have a larger Security Council, one that is more accurately representative of world population and global influence, that isn't just an anachronism from the end of World War II. But the precise membership, I don't have a clear sense in my own head of who it ought to be. Bigger, but I wouldn't want to tell you who's in and who's out without thinking more about it.
So Kiran, because you were right in the cockpit of the UN, do you have any thoughts to add on this one?
Well, I think it was quite striking that everybody agreed that the Security Council, as presently composed, is no longer representative, and that it needed to be enlarged to recover legitimacy. Because, for example, you had some demonstrative flouting of mandatory sanctions over the last few years, and I think that's connected to the fact that people didn't feel it was representative. But that's where it ended. How big? How would it work? Who should they be? There's no agreement on any of that. And I also got the strong impression that at least several of the permanent members, while paying lip service to an increase in the number of permanent members, actually were perfectly happy with the situation as it was, because compact is a bit more effective. You've already got 15, and when I used to brief the council in the informal consultations afterwards, it took at least an hour and a half. So if you add it to, if you make it 24, 25, you're going to make every single subject nearer 3 hours than 2. And you'd have to have some really strong agreement on procedures to keep it working in any way efficiently.
Going to go up there.
Yeah, my name is Valerian. I'm a Cameroonian journalist. I'm a mid-career student and Mason Fellow. Now my question is, would you recommend the use of American power to such, say, noble ends like overthrowing a dictator like Saddam Hussein from a human rights perspective?
Michael and I have had,
Go for it, brother.
Michael and I have had many conversations on this basic topic. And I don't think there's an absolute, black-white answer that yes, I would in all circumstances, no, I never would in any circumstances. I think one of the uses of American power is in cases of gross human rights violations or genocides that are taking place, where then the question becomes, can we and should we do anything about it? So the answer is yes under some circumstances. I'd want to be confident that we knew what we were doing, that we had a plausible theory for how we could effectively use our power to remove that individual, and that we thought, and again, we had a well-founded basis for believing we could do that at acceptable cost, and that the eventual end result would be superior. So I'm setting a fairly high standard for when we go in, right? And I'm setting circumstances where we really are very confident that once we get there, we'll know what we're doing. Now, one of the reasons I thought the invasion of Iraq was a mistake was I didn't think the compelling moral case was there, despite the fact that he was a brutal dictator, but the most grotesque human rights violations were no longer taking place. All right? And second, I was pretty confident that we were going to make things worse, which I think tragically has turned out to be true. Does that mean that I would never contemplate it in any and all circumstances? No, I don't think that's an appropriate position.
Let me piggyback a question off this one. Does offshore balancing imply that you think it's a mistake for the United States to try and shape the domestic environments, for example, in the Middle East, say with democracy promotion, support for civil society, trying to change the board by that kind of sort of semi-soft power stuff? Offshore balancing tends to imply to me that you really want to stay offshore and leave the domestic environments of these states on their own, because it's just, we don't do it well enough.
I think it's not generally, we're not very good at it as a government policy. I think we're actually remarkably good at it in a couple of other areas. The American democracy, for all the flaws that Americans see in the way our democratic system operates, the American democratic system is still, I think, widely respected. Florida election results notwithstanding. And part of it is not so much the actual workings of our political system, but rather it's the fact that there is freedom of speech, that the rule of law does tend to operate pretty well here, not perfectly, but pretty well here. That people envy, that people admire, that even throughout the Arab world, you get lots of statements, boy, I wish we had something more like that. Within the Palestinian community, you actually get envy of the Israeli political system. Boy, we wish we had something that worked more like the Israeli political system as opposed to the one we've got. The other institution that, in my view, turns out to have a tremendous positive effect is American higher education, which turns out, by far more foreign students come to study in the United States than any other country. They learn a lot about the United States while they're here. Not all of them have positive experiences, but most of them seem to. And in places like this, a plug for the Kennedy School, I think they often learn an awful lot about open markets, rule of law, the workings of democracies, and most importantly, they get to watch how Americans argue with each other about a variety of these things. That, to me, if you're patient, is a more effective way of promoting democracy, promoting human rights, than trying to do it with the 82nd Airborne.
Question there.
Yes, my name is Jeremy Sturchio. I'm a first-year MPP here. Professors, distinguished panelists, thanks for doing this. My question is for Professor Walt. It seemed that a central premise of the first few slides you put up was that negative opinions of America globally are bad for Americans overall. And yet it strikes me that that's not a politically popular attitude. In fact, the greatest applause lines in some of the last campaigns had to do with sort of poking fun at the rest of the world and putting forth this very sort of, aggressive, one would say, some could say arrogant foreign policy. So my question is, what are the real costs of negative opinions, both short and long run, so that Americans can start to understand what the choices are and potential impacts of not changing course?
Yeah. It actually dovetails with what we were just talking about on democracy. If we like democracy around the world and we think governments basically ought to represent to a large extent the views of their own people, then rising anti-Americanism is a problem because it will make leaders who might be inclined to support us or might be inclined to give the United States the benefit of the doubt think twice. Right? It is no accident that Gerhard Schroeder took the policy that he did prior to the war in Iraq. He could read public opinion polls and he had an election to run. It is not surprising that the government of Spain withdrew from Iraq after their election because that was seen as a representation of what the Spanish people wanted. The other point is that if global opinion shifts against the United States, all right, I believe that also increases the population of genuine extremists way out there who are willing to use violence against the United States or against American friends. So we're both making it harder for leaders to support us, and we're increasing the number of potential bin Ladens out there, and neither one is a good thing for the United States.
Can I just add a tiny word? Because in your book, I mean, one of the few things I disagreed with in your book was a suggestion that the Spanish government lost the election because of their presence in Iraq. Actually, until about 3 days before the election, they were really comfortably ahead. I think they were well over 5% ahead. And they lost the election, it's very clear, because they lied about the reasons for the explosions in Madrid. They tried to pretend it was an ETA matter and not an Al-Qaeda matter, and they were not forgiven for that. One of the paradoxes, if you live in democracies, is the fact that the British public were strongly against the war in Iraq, yet the Labour Party won. The Spanish government would have won, I think it's pretty clear, but for them lying about the reasons for those explosions. The Australian and the Spanish public was strongly against. The Australian public was strongly against, and yet the Australian government again won the last election rather comfortably. So it's obviously not a it's not a one-issue thing, holding elections in democracies.
Let us now try to engage in extraordinary self-discipline up here and down there. I want to go right around in one loop. So let's go here and then there and then there and then home.
Good evening. My name is Kiran Mercado. I'm a first-year MPAID. And my question is for Mr. Walt. And it's regarding policy towards foreign policy, obviously. But for example, I don't agree with, the lady in the panel said before that we should put our agenda forth regardless. And the question arises whether we're right or wrong sometimes. For example, you mentioned the case of Ukraine and Syria, where things went right, but you didn't mention the case of Haiti and Venezuela, where the situation was very similar with Ukraine, but it was actually counterproductive for the opposition. So my question is, when do we stop? How do we set policies so that we deal with these inconsistencies? I mean, Venezuela and Ukraine are two very similar cases that we dealt with very differently.
You want to just go around? You want us to take all the questions?
Let's try and collect. Let's do a collect.
This is a question for anyone on the panel willing to answer it. What advice would you give to President Abbas of Palestine on how he can tame American power?
Hi, my name is Stefan. My question is also for anyone on the panel. I wonder if you comment about the size of the U.S. military, whether it's justified, and how it might relate to the strategy of offshore balancing.
Question here.
Yes, hello, my name is Philip Kruger. I'm half German, half French. I have a short question regarding how Germany or France could act in the future. I think sometimes in Europe we have the perception that taming American power is not possible. It's possible to influence its definition of leadership and reevaluate this definition. And my question would be, how could France and Germany interact in that process of redefining leadership?
Okay, how are we going to divvy this up? Zania, I haven't heard from you, so is there one of these you want to take?
Honestly?
You don't want to take any of them. You haven't got a choice.
I'll take the first.
Fine.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see you. You suggested that I said that we should put out our policy regardless. If I said that, I didn't mean to say that. What I suggested was that there are times in which the US taking the leadership role in getting out of policy is the only way that something might happen. Not always. I certainly wouldn't suggest we did, and I think Steve in his book and Kiran they've both mentioned a number of occasions where we maybe haven't taken the right approach to a problem. You asked, how do we deal with the inconsistencies in US policy? The problem is, and this is why I didn't want to answer any of the questions, the problem is that I don't think you can and I don't think you will. One of the problems that Steve lays out is US legitimacy. Do we have legitimacy in the actions we take? Are we hypocritical? And sadly, the answer is often yes, we are. Depending on whether something is of vital national interest to the United States, we will act differently. Depending on where you are located geographically, we will act differently. Depending on the kind of natural resources you have and the importance to ourselves, we will act differently. Depending on the type of government you have, we will act differently. Does it make it very confusing for other people? Absolutely. Is it nevertheless the right way to approach each problem? I would say yes, it is. I would hate to think that any government, US or otherwise, would take a certain number of inputs and say, well, because we've acted in a certain way under these circumstances, it is similar to what's going on in another country, and we'll take the cookie cutter approach. So inconsistencies, absolutely. Does it confuse people? Does it make it harder for us to understand how other countries are going to react to our actions? Yes. Is it the right way to go? Probably yes.
Steve.
I'll try to answer all four very, very quickly. On the very first question, I think the United States has to be much more humble, to use President Bush's line, about our capacity for social engineering. Right? I would not give us as much credit for, say, what happened in Lebanon as Zania would, and we could argue about that. We may have had something to do with it. I think that was mostly a set of processes occurring within Lebanon itself. We may have leaned slightly there, but we also had others leaning the French as well. But I don't think we're very good at manipulating other societies from the outside, and we ought to sort of go into any of those events recognizing that our capacity to control them is really very, very, very limited. Second, what would I tell President Abbas? I would tell President Abbas to devote a lot of effort to getting an invitation to speak before both houses of Congress and lay out his vision of Middle East peace. And to do so very explicitly, I would tell him to apologize to the Israeli people for the violence that Palestinians have done, while at the same time pointing out that the national aspirations of the Palestinian people are the explanation for that violence. He doesn't have to prostrate himself or anything like that, but make it clear that he is firmly committed, and do so in the US Congress. Make that a public speech. Third, size of the American military. I guess I like a margin of superiority. I think somewhere between 3 and 4% of GNP is not very much by historic standards, given what the United States has spent at other times. I think the composition of the US military ought to be changing. I wouldn't have it structured the way it is, and I've already said I wouldn't have anywhere near the nuclear arsenal we have, because I just can't see why we need several thousand nuclear weapons, although I wouldn't go to zero. And finally, on Germany and France, just a couple of points. First of all, the EU is quite a consequential economic actor, and the United States, in a sense, is tamed in economic negotiations when we go up with the EU. We're very powerful, we're very influential, but the EU has enormous economic weight in the world, and we tend to bargain with them much more like equals. Second, as I look at what happened over Iran, basically the EU3 have had as much influence on shaping a policy towards Iran's nuclear program as we have, and if anything, we've moved closer to their approach than what our approach was 3 or 4 years ago. And again, it's in part because Britain, France, and Germany were able to sort of link arms, have a common approach, and that approach, by the way, was intended to do two things. It was intended to restrain Iran's nuclear program, and it was intended to restrain the United States from taking military action. It had a dual purpose, and I believe we've moved at least as far as they have in adopting a common position. So Europe still has some weight out there.
We're close to wind up here. Sir Kiran, do you have one concluding
I just
thought
wanted to say
here?
maybe two sentences. One, I don't think President Abbas, Abu Mazen wants to tame American power. I think he wants to channel it. I think he thinks that American policy is blind in one eye, and he would like the Americans to open that eye and to show the same understanding for Palestinian constraints as they do for American constraints. Secondly, on the other point, I think the US should show more respect for internal dynamics because it's very, very important for ownership. I wince every time I see that Ambassador Khalilzad, is urging this, that, or the other, whether it's in Iraq or that he's been responsible for this, that, and the other in Afghanistan. You should, by all means, do good by stealth, but stand in the shadows and let countries, leaders, and so on have some ownership of their own process, because it diminishes the process if everything appears to be driven from abroad.
Well, that's where, as they say on television, we're going to leave it. There's one red thread I hear through this very strongly, is there is nothing more difficult for a great power to understand, to grasp, and to order its policy around than the simple realization of the limits of its power. Understanding its limits seems to me to be almost the biggest single difficulty in the exercise of American primacy overseas, and I think that Steve Walt's work has helped me to see that much more clearly than most other stuff I've read. I want to thank Sir Kiran, I want to thank Zania, Steve, and you for coming. That's it. Thank you.